Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Tabletop Almanac. My name is Simon, and I am your host for this channel, producer, and all the other things that happen behind and in front of the scenes. Now I'm very, very excited to bring this review and talk about this book to you today. And that is because I am an unashamed elf fan. Since I first got into fantasy, elves. I like humans. I like other species. But when it comes down to it, elves are the best. Now you might get some dwarf fans saying dwarves are the best and elves are really annoying. You might get some people saying that elves are just a substitute for people who want to roleplay characters more immortal, beautiful, blah, blah, blah than themselves or in general, and they don't want to play vampire. Hogwash. Elves are awesome. Elves are cool, whether they are Tolkien's elves, whether they are Moorcock's elves, the sadistic, vicious Melnibonéans, whether they are Forgotten Realms or Dragonlance elves, whether they are Shadowrun elves, and whether they are Warhammer elves. In this case, High Elves. High Elves were my first Warhammer Fantasy army. They were my first Warhammer Fantasy army book. They were fun. Were they overpowered? I don't know. I wasn't cognizant at that time of comparative power levels and game balance per se. I liked that they could attack with 2 ranks of spears, and now I think it was 3 because I haven't played it in a long time. I don't know what the old world has for it, but they are still cool. They're even cool if they are Talislanta elves. Talislanta has elves. Don't let the book lie to you. But here we are, the High Elf Player's Guide. In 1st edition Warhammer Fantasy, the Dwarves got a book. In 2nd edition Warhammer Fantasy, the Dwarves got a book. I don't really know much about 3rd in terms of what they got specific to the different species and peoples of the old world, but I'm pretty sure the elves did not get a book. 4th edition, the Dwarves get a book. But then, the High Elves get a book, and presumably the Wood Elves will later on. Which I'm also excited to see, because they're cool too, but they're not High Elves. Now, if you're somewhat familiar or only passingly familiar with the High Elves of Warhammer, they are a mix, in a sense, between Tolkien's long-lived, immortal, we are more knowledgeable about the world and its caretakers and superior to everybody else, etc., in a sort of Moorcockian, Melnibonéan adjacent style, because that really becomes the Dark Elves. But there are some elements of both represented in the rules here. And this is a book all about High Elves, how to play them, special rules for them. It's not the Game Master's Guide, so it doesn't cover campaigns and the greater geography of Ulthuan, but it covers more than enough. Now, one thing off the start, I haven't playtested these things, the new rules and so on. I've read through them, I've created characters with them. Generally, my attitude towards Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is that something might look overpowered and then they die in the next fight. Because that's what you do in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, is you die in fights. So even if you are a centuries-old elf with stats up the wazoo, you still will die. And because you have lower fate and so on, you will die. So in terms of balance, there's only one little area which I'll talk about that may or may not be a thing for your table. But in terms of the actual rules and competency, I don't care. I would suggest you don't care. So long as you look at the integrating a high elf with the rest of a non-high elf party. Okay, so let's talk about the book. First, this was provided to me for review purposes by Cubicle 7, so I'd like to thank them very much. None of that, of course, influences my attitudes towards the book, and as I hopefully impressed upon you, I love high elves. So whether I got a review copy or not, I would still love High Elves. And to be honest, I think this is a very cool book. So let's talk a bit about it. The Asur, the name for the High Elves, are the inhabitants of Ulthuan. They are one of the oldest species in the old world, and they act like it. Ulthuan is kind of an Atlantis-like, middle of the Atlantic island that's kind of in a crescent with an island in the middle that has a gate to the realm of chaos that they try to keep shut. If you have read the High Elf Armies books from Warhammer Fantasy Battles and so on, then the history of this will ring very familiar. The history section and the geography/cultural section of this. It's been a long time since I looked at that book, but it felt very familiar coming back to it. It's like, oh, I remember that character. I remember that character. I remember what they were doing here. Oh, this is how things fell apart for the High Elf people. That part should be pretty familiar to you. If not, it is a quite comprehensive history of the High Elves. And it's not long. One of the biggest problems I find with history sections in books is that they always take a long time and cram a lot into it. When I said that a lot of this was familiar from the High Elf Armies book, the High Elf Armies book wasn't going to get into rules for careers or things like that. It was going to give you army unit stats, and it was going to give you a history and context for it. I feel, at least in terms of this book versus the Armies book, it had more history, or maybe more detailed history. This has a good amount of history, enough for you as a player to get a sense of where your High Elf character came from, or their people came from, where they might be going, their general mentality, and so on. I have seen it noted a couple times. There's an interesting thing that they refer to Malekith as Malarian. I don't know if and when that was an adjustment, but not a huge deal, right? It doesn't change anything, and you can always call him Malekith if you want. That's the High Elf guy that becomes a Dark Elf and, does horrible things. But you'll know when you read it. So it's about 18 pages, not exclusively text. There's a lot of beautiful art, of course. It's Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. There's always beautiful art in these books. The layout is good. It's 2-column. Every header is bolded, and the kerning and line spacing makes it a very easy read. And it covers the rise, maybe they're already at the top, but the sort of fall and semi-decline of the High Elves, bringing them back to the present day with the Phoenix King, Finnebar the Seafarer, who has made an effort to recontact and rejuvenate relationships with the rest of the old world. Okay, so that's the history. The society part is one of the areas I found most interesting and most helpful. When you're role-playing, you need to know the society of a culture, of a species. You can make it up, of course, but if you made it up, then you wouldn't need the books, so let's put that to the side and forget about it. This is a very good examination of how a peoples that are immortal, very long-lived, and very, very powerful as a result, structure themselves. There are nobles, there are noble houses, there are lesser nobles, there are low-born, working-class citizen-y types. So it's the same thing as anywhere else. That's what happens, is you get these, no matter what the people are, they create hierarchies and tiers. You get a good amount of detail, not overwhelmingly. It's almost a paragraph in some cases of the different kingdoms of the High Elves and what the people there are like, and it's perfectly enough to start playing and start working through it. One of my favorites, Safari, is in there, and I just get a good impression of them as being intellectuals, magical beings, and students, and so on and so forth, academics, yada yada. The Outer Kingdoms, is one of the Inner Kingdoms. The Outer Kingdoms are the ones that will be more in contact with outer peoples, so dark elves or humans. Kothic is the home of Lothern, and if you're familiar with the Lothern Sea Guard, they are sort of the Marines of High Elf society. You get very good examination of their upbringing and what it's like to live in High Elf society and to grow up in it. I think this is very important because how frequently do you get, oh, well, my High Elf or my elf is a couple of centuries old, but they have the same stats as a starting human character in some other games. Now, of course, if you're looking at Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, they don't. They get additional characteristics. They start a little higher and so on, partly to represent this. But it's a good way to help show their psychology and mentality, which is one of those difficult things. How do you play a character who is at least 100 years old? Are they the equivalent of an 18-year-old human? Are they still 100? It's just that they look at themselves as roughly the same age proportionally to a human of 18 years old. You know, how does it all really work out in terms of maturity, in terms of so on? And this does a good job of showing you how it works, that how they grow in their emotional maturity when they become an adult, the rite of ascension at age 50, how arranged marriages work, and so on. Now, as a side note, there are, of course, sidebars covering, the separate things. So the Rite of Ascension gets its own little sidebar. Plot hooks get their own little sidebars. They, in fact, have a hook image through them, which is clever. But not bad. I mean, that's an easy way to recognize it. You get information on titles, how they address each other, and so on, especially when you've got all these nobles running around. Information on the Everqueen in Avalorn, and the bloodline of Anarion, and the various difficulties that come along with belonging to it. There is a good amount when they get into the section on Nagarythe and the Kinstrife, on the war with the Dark Elves, the Drukai. Druki, don't really know what. I'd say Drukai. Other species, so humans, wood elves, different cultures of humans, from Bretonnians to Marienburgers, all get treatment here, and not much of a history per se necessarily, a little bit with the dwarves because of the War of the Beard and so on, but enough to get an idea of how the High Elves are represented in these places. What do they think of when they think of Tilea and Estalia? What do they think of Norskins or Kislevites? What do they think of the Azrai, of the Wood Elves, and so on, compared to themselves as High Elves? Right? There is a section on their military and their forces and how they set up outposts throughout the world, some which are very interesting if you want to use it as a plot hook or a setting to start from. Let's see, some of the ones I really like here are the Citadel of Dusk in Lustria is great because it's Lustria, and if you want more details on Lustria, get the book Lustria. But other ones like the Tower of the Sun is a fortress that watches over the southern ocean. There's a Caledonian warden prince who sort of not garrisons, commands the fortress there, and how the Everqueen arrives there every decade, how there's a lot of fighting in the jungle, beastmen, and how there's a ritual performed by the Everqueen, making it her purpose for traveling there. Then there are other ones too. I like all of them, and they all provide a neat little. Again, I don't want to say hook. Let's say setting seed that can translate into a campaign. There is, of course, information on trade, their own craftsmanship. So, what is an elven sword like compared to a human sword? What are the stats for a greatsword of Hoth? A pronunciation guide might be helpful. I'm just thinking of that now. It's different when you write it out, of course, but when you have to read it, then yeah, everyone gets their own little pronunciations. And so beyond the Greatsword of Hoth, things like dragon armor, the white lion cloaks, the very unique items of the high elf armies and martial peoples get represented here, along with less martial elements like herbs, cosmetics, and appearance-related products and tools all get a presence here, as well as enchanted items like phoenix feathers, various staves, way shards, and things like that. In addition, the relationship with the dragons and how high elf merchants and trade really show their impact on the old world, or the world in general. Now, let's get to high elf characters. To me, high elf characters is really the thing that I wanted out of this, and I was not disappointed. There are some interesting things here. So, high elf characters. They talk about how to play an archetypal high elf, right? The snobby one who treats everyone else as lesser than them. And you can do that with your characteristic bonuses, the starting ones that make you mechanically a little better. But of course, it would be useless to not talk about exceptions or situations where the Asur wants to interact with people outside of their own culture, so the other peoples of the old world, and why they would belong to, I guess, an adventuring party, sort of wandering around the Reichland or the Border Princes or wherever. But the thing that gets... Okay, bear in mind, haven't looked at the Warhammer High Elf Armies books since the first one, so I don't know if Yen Louis showed up there or not. Yen Louis is one of the things that, in my opinion, helps balance high elves to other species. And Yen Louis is about... It's an emotional state about keeping control of powerful emotions. Kind of a Vulcan-y sort of thing. The nature of it is a balance between darkness and light. Darkness leading to depravity, light leading to world weariness, if you go to extremes in either direction. The point of Asur's spirituality is to harmonize these two. And it's a psychology trait that gets tracked. So your character will move towards each end of it depending on how you behave. Cruelty and so on moves you towards dark. Kindness and abstinence move you towards light. So, they're maybe a little obvious, but they're a way to balance this. And once one moves too far to one side or the other, you start to get test modifier penalties And in some cases, so for example, light, you become indecisive or aloof or insensitive. Dark, you are sadistic and sociopathic, right? Neither of these are good for a harmonious party. So, or a harmonious character. So, find harmony. Find a way to balance it. And that leads into obsessions, where the leaning too far in one direction or another gives you an obsession, which is the sort of thing that drives them. If it's glory or vengeance or even collecting art, it pushes the high elf to act to an extreme. And this is essentially a replacement for a long-term ambition. It's the primary motivating force of them. And the state, your Yen-Lui state, will determine how it works and how it affects you. There are some example obsessions you can pick as well. There are a few other things. I'm not going to get into every single thing because I do want to talk about how Yen-Lui fits into things as well, specifically with elders. And so Elder Asur, it's another step of character creation where you choose to play an elder. An elder is a high elf who has lived through many ages of Asur society. So you get a chart of age, a randomization of their age, when they were born, their experience, and any sort of burden they might come through. So if you're only 40 to 130 years old in the time of ending, you are the default high elf character. You won't have any additional times you've lived through. But say you were born in the time of incursion, 210 to 350 years old. You lived through the Great Chaos Incursion, maybe you fought at the Cathik, Finuval Plain, the Gates of Kislev, and you begin with burdens equal to when you started and the other ages you lived through. So, for example, at the time of incursion, you start with corruption points, and every week you might move closer towards a light state of Yen-Lui. And then you have to take the time of steel one, which is next, which will also, it supersedes in some cases. The Yen-Lui test for that one overwrites the other. But then you have other things where you only start with one extra point to spend on fate or resilience. So, yes, and then of course as a benefit you get more points to spend in skills for advances and so on. So, yes, technically you might be a little more powerful, but you have a lot to handle at the same time. And it's a great role-playing opportunity to have a high elf who is centuries and ages old, who's leaned way too far into the light side of Yen-Lui, and in the middle of a very critical moment pauses to try to decide on their course of action because they want to weigh things properly. Maybe that'll be a pain in the behind for the rest of the party, but it makes for, in my opinion, a very interesting bit of roleplay. Of course, while your mileage may vary, your group's mileage may vary, and please be mindful of everyone at the table if you are playing that, or if you're the GM, you're allowing that. You've got to be aware of the consequences of these things. Then there's also information on Sea Elves. Sea Elves are the trading ones, the ones that go all about, the most cosmopolitan, a little less hierarchical, but they mainly engage in trade, and they're the ones that frequently interact with the rest of the world. They're explorers, they are adventurers, they're the ones that have left the disciplined and stratified Ulthuan for a free life of travel. And there are different starting skills and talents for the different elven kingdoms, there are also ones for sea elves, and new talents, and so on. Names, etc. Careers. Okay. So I'm not going to get into every single career, but there's a new random class and career table, depending on the kingdom you come from, and geared towards high elves. So it jettisons any of the careers that are really not appropriate for them, and modifies existing careers to make them more appropriate for high elves, and it inserts the new careers that show up in the book. So there's a good amount of adaptation going on, even for things like pit fighters, talking about elven gladiators. And this could even be a sort of career you might have had way in the past. The one though that I wanted to see most of all are my favorite unit, my favorite part of the High Elves, and that's the Sword Masters of Hoth. Warrior scholars, studied in the art of war, who train in the pursuit of perfection, carrying magical greatswords upon their backs. And there is a career and advanced scheme for them. They get the sword, they get the mail shirt and the tall helmet. The trapping is a tall helmet. They learn art, they learn leadership, and balance of the soul. I don't know if you would compare them directly to samurai or anything like that. They're not really, but I very much enjoy that sort of monastic, wandering swordmaster style. And there's new martial arts talent and the way of the sword, a thing that is a talent for the swordmasters that lets you move quickly, lets you throw your sword, do other really cool martial arts stuff. But your Yen Lui balance, your spiritual balance, is important when it comes to this as well. Again, another set of balance. I don't know if the intention necessarily was to make Yen Lui the way of mechanically balancing high elves now against everyone else, but I think it's a good one. And I think it's a very useful one mechanically and for roleplay. There are other careers, but that was the one I wanted to really focus on. Now, if you know of the High Elves, and you know of High Magic, and how the colleges of magic are just, refractions of the different colors of the winds of magic, as if through a crystal, but the High Magic is the energy before it goes in there. And you do get guidance on how to train a mage, how to achieve magehood, the path they have to go on. There are new spells for elves, both petty magic and greater magic. There's a talent that lets you learn high magic. It's called Blessed by Isha, and there is a long list of things that you need to have before you can start learning it. So it is a goal, hashtag life goals. Definitely for there. Thankfully, there is also a Q&A for that, which is pretty helpful. Just sort of the most likely questions that will come up regarding it for players and for the GMs then to have at their disposal to answer. All right, there's a great bit on High Elf religion and elven priests, and I think it's a very interesting, not necessarily interesting pantheon, but interesting religious belief or spiritual belief. They don't pray to the Kedai or the Kithrai are the dark elfin ones, the nastier ones like Cain and so on. But the underworld gods, Kedai, are gods of the heavens. They don't pray to them, but they pray to sort of as like guidance, not intervene on my behalf, but show me how to overcome my challenge. Their gods are always with them. Every thought and action is a devotion to a god. It blends itself into their culture and into their life in a way that, while it might be familiar to Old Worlders, Reichlanders, and so on, is still a different relationship with their gods. And it's nice to have have that whole bit of detail in there. Now, the High Elves have a long bit of history with the Slaanesh and pleasure cults, which get covered here as both a threat and something to get involved in, maybe, if that's the direction you want your PC to go. And I say that because it's included in this book. My belief then is that it's intended that you could go down this path. Otherwise, this should be in the GM's book. There probably will be more in the GM's book. And then, of course, there's still other stuff, factions and so on. You get a good, like I said, you get a really good look at High Elf society here. And then one of the last sections is called an intrigue. And it's a set, I would call it a challenge. It's a challenge where a character tries to manipulate another into supporting their position. They don't persuade. They don't sit there and say, you should do this because it would be beneficial for you. They insinuate, they lend support. Basically, they do everything to change the target's way of thinking to align themselves with their own goals. And there are a number of steps involved in that, which get detailed here. And is an interesting thing if you want to play a High Elf political campaign, for example. Or even have High Elves in a political campaign in a different place, maybe Marienburg, maybe somewhere in Altdorf, And so leverage and things like that, get rules here to help build it up. And that is basically the High Elf Player's Guide. A little anticlimactic at the end, but it is a good book. And to me, it's a very exciting book because we haven't gotten this thing before. For me, the complete book of elves in AD&D, as unbalanced as it may have been, was one of my favorite books. The High Elf Player's Guide is now also one of my favorite books. I want to play. I run Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, a couple of groups, but I like to play. And I like to play High Elf. Ideally a Swordmaster, but I'm flexible. But probably a Swordmaster. So to me let's stop for a second. I've already been very clear I'm predisposed towards wanting to do this, but there is that rule adage that the effective splat books are the ones that make you want to play it after reading it, even if you didn't beforehand. So if you take a look at this as a result of the review, and prior to that you were like, I don't want to have anything to do with High Elves, and you read it and go, okay, fine. Please leave a message in the comments to let me know about that, because I am a bit biased on this. I wanted to play one. I would love to play one before, and I really want to play one now. So it has enhanced that, but more because I've gotten the mechanical options to do it. I think it's a great book. I think it has everything you need in a player's guide for a specific type of character. So I recommend going to get the High Elf Player's Guide for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th Edition from Cubicle 7, unless you just don't want anything to do with High Elves. I can't change your mind there. But if your mind is possibly changeable, hopefully this did it for you. So until next time, my name is Simon. I am the producer of the Tabletop Almanac, and please check out other reviews, check out the actual plays, subscribe, like, follow whatever's coming up here. There's some fun stuff with other excellent people who are not me, but I'm involved in these things as well. Check it out. There's a link in the notes to the Cubicle 7 store. Please use that to pick it up. Until next time, be excellent to each other, and good luck.